on, man.
Yeah, it's weird because I live in a desert also, so I didn't expect it to rain there or in the UAE. So I guess I flew over something, decided just follow me here.
Yeah.
But see, you were blaming Joe Biden earlier, so I'm just going to go with that. I'm going to blame Joe Biden leaving the country. I don't know.
Yeah, I was talking about the fact that last time we had a huge storm was when George W. Bush left in 2007, and the day after, and this time the day after Joe Biden
so
left,
it's not
we
my
had
fault.
huge storms. So,
Yeah.
But anyway, so but this concept of the storm, right? So in Words of Radiance and The Way of Kings, the whole Stormlight series, the storms have a very kind of center piece to the narrative. A lot of power, a lot of energy emanates from that and sort of fuels into the world. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that and your thinking and how you developed that?
Yeah, so in fantasy, one of the distinctive aspects of what makes a novel a fantasy novel is that the setting is so different, so evocative. Like a book is really three things, right? It is characters, it is plot, and it is setting. And I say they're held together by conflict, right? Now, in a fantasy book, our setting, we kind of turn a light onto the setting and do distinctive things. And when a fantasy book's really working well, the setting becomes a character. And part of the reason for this is you want to immerse people in another world. When we talk about epic fantasy, each genre that you'll read has some emotions natively attached to it. And I should say that all great books are going to have solid characters. They're going to have solid narrative and solid plot and a solid setting. It doesn't have to be fantasy to have a good setting. There are fantastic books out there that immerse you in a setting that is in our world. But in fantasy, we make that fantastical. And one of those emotions that we really want is this sense of immersion. It started with Grandpa Tolkien. We often point to him as kind of the launcher of epic fantasy. And in Tolkien, the setting was alive, it lived, it breathed, and you were never allowed to go more than a few pages without being reminded, hey, you're not on Earth. This is a new place, a new culture, a new setting.
Yeah.
And so when I'm writing my books, often what I'm looking for is I'm looking to try and determine how am I going to make that setting a character. And great characters have a narrative to them.
Yep.
They have an arc. They have conflict. They have personality and quirks. And with the Stormlight, I was really looking at this idea of a storm. The storms in our life are these dramatic things. We saw this a couple days ago, right? The storm that blew through here. When you're not ready for it, it can upend lives.
Yeah.
I was supposed to go visit schools yesterday. And that didn't happen because all the schools in the city got let out, and everyone's like, "Don't drive, don't drive." The water, we don't have drainage. You just can't. And that's a time when our setting, when there's a storm, we can't just ignore our setting anymore. It's almost like nature's like, no, you're going to pay attention to me right now.
Yeah.
You've been ignoring me. You can't do that. You live in a place, and as humans, we like to acclimatize everything to ourselves, right?
Yeah.
The buildings and whatnot, we make it just perfect for us. But when there's a storm going on, you can't ignore that. I was mentioning, I heard the thunder, despite being buried in the middle of a hotel. You can hear it. It shakes the building.
Yeah.
And that personality, that character was fascinating to me. And I started working on the Stormlight Archive kind of officially in 2002. And the idea for the storm, of this magical storm, this thing that shaped all life around it, was the real seed for that setting. What I looked at is I tried to determine, how is this going to feel? How is life adapted to living in a place where periodically this destructive storm comes through? One of my models for this were tidal pools.
Okay.
Because I liked how, if you look at the tidal pool, the tides come in, the tides are just this powerful force that then washes things out. And then a lot of the plant life and animal life has to be able to live both above the water and below the water and things like this. And so I studied that a lot. I studied islands that dealt with hurricanes and how you'll see these hurricanes blow through and wipe out all the foliage, and then things like grow back up in a very interesting way. So this is all stuff that I was looking at, trying to build this personality of the storm.
Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned there was that in a great sort of fantasy novel, and great books generally, conflict is central to creating dramatic tension, right?
So conflict's the glue, right?
Conflict's the glue, and keeps the reader turning the pages. So one of the things that I noticed when I started reading The Way of Kings was the conflict that you set up between the light eyes and the dark eyes.
Yep.
And that kind of, almost like that hierarchical caste system.
Right.
Could you just talk a little bit about that and the importance of that in the overall story arc?
So, in the books, one of the things I was looking at doing is I wanted to deal with the idea of the caste system, right? I wanted to deal with the idea of inequality and these things, but one of the great things about fantasy, and why I like writing fantasy, and one of the things that it's a tool we have that a lot of genres don't have, is we can kind of take an issue and we can rip it away from its roots, and we can create a fantastical version of it, so that we can deal with it without some of the baggage. Where we can look at it and say, okay, this isn't a black-white struggle. This isn't, a cultural struggle that we understand. We're going to boil it down to what's kind of about human nature that's causing that. Create a fantastical version, and then deal with it in almost a safe way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That when you read it, you still kind of feel that anger and indignation, but you don't have to feel that the characters are pointing fingers at you when they are being racist. And I like that a lot about fantasy, because you can deal with some of these issues. For instance, a lot of the main characters in the Stormlight archive are racist. They're products of a culture that is racist. They're very sexist, these sorts of things. And the idea is that in the narrative, we can have them deal with these issues. We can talk about it. But at the same time, the book doesn't have to be about culturally sweeping revolutions in these areas. Certainly, certain characters will come to understandings. But it seems like particularly in America, where we talk a lot about racism, if you deal with racist issues, you kind of have to make a whole book about that.
Right.
Whereas in a fantasy book, you say, look, this is an aspect to their lives. The main revolution is not about the fact that most of the Alethi kind of look down on the Herdazians, even though we don't talk about it a lot. There is that thing, and then we've got the more forefronted light eyes versus dark eyes, and then we've got the whole Parshendi and non-Parshendi thing. So there's different levels of racism that people are dealing with, and their own prejudices, and it works for me in a fantasy novel to deal with these issues in a way that it's so much more digging at the roots of them.
Okay.
Where I feel like sometimes it's difficult to get below the superficial stuff if you don't have this fantastical representation.
So it's almost creating that kind of safe, sort of almost like a ball you can look into, and you set the story in that without pointing out.
And you can do it with things like racial. It's not as deep. For instance, Elantris, my first book. I have a magical disease. The whole book focuses around people who catch this terrible magical disease. And it was based off the idea of leper colonies. But by taking it, not making it leprosy, making it my own thing, we can deal with it in the narrative in a way that lets me determine how you get healed from it, what causes it, the religious implications, and all of these things. And that one, it's not so much a charged issue as much as something like racism is, but it still offers me a huge advantage as a fantasy writer to take something from our world as an inspiration, transpose it to a fantastical world, make the rules my own, and then be able to construct a narrative and story around it in a way you couldn't do in a contemporary realistic novel.
Okay. Now, one of the things that your novels are quite heavy on is sort of the backstory of what's going on. So in words of Radiance, you've got the Knights Radiant, you've got the Void Bringers, and so on and so on. How do you strike that kind of balance between too much exposition and moving the story forward at a pace that is going to keep turning pages?
This is the kind of, in my class with my students, I call this the grand skill of writing fantasy novels, which is the ability, Here's a metaphor for you, this story. My wife likes to feed I have 3 little boys. They're 3, 6, and 8. My wife likes to feed them spinach. It's good for them. They don't like to eat spinach. So what does she do? She makes them a smoothie every morning with all the stuff they like it, and then she dumps spinach in it to turn it green. They think the spinach is just there to make it green because they like the color green and they think it's cool to drink something green, right? They just don't eat green stuff very often in a drink form or whatever. And so they think it's really fun. You throw on the spinach, it turns green, they eat it. She's hiding the spinach in plain sight in front of them. Fantasy novels, one of the reasons we read fantasy is we like this other world. We like the sense of wonder and immersion. And this is what draws us to this genre. But at the same time, if you just put it all as big dumps of information, it's boring. As much as we love it, we're just going to get bored. And so the grand skill of a fantasy novelist is the ability to almost hide it like my wife hides the spinach, is to slip it in by making it relevant to the characters, by making them have thoughts, discussions, arguments about the setting, having to deal with the storms and these things, so that you slip it in so it becomes an integral aspect of the story, rather than, here is a big dump of information. Now that you have that, we can tell a story. We take that information, we make it part of the story. And a lot of writers, that's one of the hardest things to figure out, how to get that balance down. Yeah. And every writer's balance is also different. And every book's balance is different. And a fun comparison would be to compare Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive. If you've read both of those, in Mistborn I go very easy on the world building up front. I start with the ash and the weather again, but I ease you into the magic. I don't hit you in the face with it. And in Stormlight, I start with a prologue that is, here is the magic. There's a lot of world building in this book, so we're going to start early, and we're gonna kind of make you work early in this book, just because there's so much to do. And those are 2 different books with 2 different styles of mixing that in. It's almost more like Stormlight Archive. I'm like, all right, we're gonna start with a salad. We'll put all sorts of fun stuff on it so you like it, but we're gonna start with the salad. And in Mistborn, it's really putting the salad hidden in the blender with your smoothie a lot more.
Yeah, okay. So even Words of Radiance then is set within this kind of bigger picture, right? This cosmere,
yes.
which you made, which then it links all of your novels together in some respects. And there are these kind of shards that have landed on different planets, and they create different magical properties and so on. Now, what was really of interest to me was how you broke up that sort of cosmere into the physical, the cognitive, and almost like the spiritual realm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, could you just say a few words about that?
Sure. So for those who aren't aware, all of my epic fantasy books are connected. We call them the cosmere. Now, when I was conceiving this, one of my goals was to make sure that it was never something that distracted you from the book. Meaning, if you just want to read Mistborn and you're not interested in all this other stuff, when you read Mistborn, you don't feel like there's huge holes in your understanding because you haven't read the Stormlight Archive or you haven't read Warbreaker or whatnot. And so the idea was to make this Easter eggs, to sneak it in so that those who really want to dig deep could find that there is more, and that there is a philosophy underpinning all of these. And you mentioned the realmatic theory, which is that in the Cosmere and Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, we get the magic is based on this idea of there's 3 realms, and there's everything exists in these 3 realms. Well, it's very Platonic. I don't know if you guys have read Plato, but Plato had this philosophy where all things existed in their own realm.